remotely can hear me okay. We will be recording this so that we can put it up on the website for many folks that were not able to join us in person or live. We wanted to take an opportunity to have a moderated sort of Q&A with our guests, as well as make sure that we're having a chance to ask questions about this very important work. Those of you joining us remotely, please feel free to use the chat function. And those of you in person, by all means, please raise your hand and make sure that you don't feel that you need to hold on to your question until so this can really be a true discussion. It's a pleasure to welcome mezzo-soprano Nina Yoshida Nelsen, who's in the midst of a season that is taking her to stages across the United States. This season includes debuts with Boston Lyric Opera, Bard Opera, Chicago Opera Theater, Washington National Opera, and a return to Opera Santa Barbara and Kentucky Opera. Recent season highlights for Nina have included engagements with New York Opera Chicago, Anchorage Opera, Seattle Opera, Utah Opera, Sarasota Opera, New York City Opera, and many others. Importantly, in spring 2021, Nina co-founded the Asian Opera Alliance, an organization aimed at advocating for greater Asian representation, while also striving for broader equity. She has worked with and advised companies that include the Metropolitan Opera, San Francisco Opera, the Dallas Opera, and many others. So in addition to her performing and advocacy work, she's also recently been named an artistic advisor at Boston. As you can tell, she has a wonderful perspective to share with us, so please welcome Nina. So to get started, I'd love for you to share how, in addition to the very busy schedule you have, and in addition to being co-founder of the Asian Opera Alliance, what was it that made you want to add this work with this organization to your?
First of all, thank you all for having me here today. Like, doing this in person, I've been doing it over Zoom for the past 2 years. You are my first in-person group to meet with. It's very exciting. Thank you. And for engaging in this, sometimes difficult conversation. Thank you for having me here. So I kind of have a not normal career trajectory. Not that there necessarily is one even anymore these days, but I was married before I was an opera singer. I found out I was pregnant right as I found out I was making my first professional debut. So I've been a mom since I've been an opera singer and a wife since before I was an opera singer. And in spring of 2021, after the shootings in Atlanta, I was at home actually my family moved to California for the pandemic. So we were at home at my mom's house, and I came across an opera company who made a social media post that said, "We support our Asian artists," and it's an opera company that I've worked at several times. And I looked at this post that had a bunch of pictures of Asian artists, and I thought to myself, wow, this is really interesting. Every single person in this post has been typecast into an Asian role, myself included. And so I wrote to a friend of mine who worked at this company in PR, and I said, take a look at this post that just happened. Every single one of these Asian artists was typecast into an Asian role. I said, the next thing that has to change in our opera industry is for us to stop pigeonholing people of color into roles of color. And so she asked me, Nina, in a typical season, how many non-Asian roles do you sing? And I had no idea, because I knew I had done a lot of Suzuki's, over 150 Suzuki's, a ton. I've done 7 or 8 world premieres of Asian identifying operas. Some of them I've done 7 or 8 times. I've done concerts and recitals. My husband's a horn player. He teaches at IU and plays with Canadian brass. So we do recitals everywhere. And I never had taken the time to think about how many non-Asian roles I had done. And I sat down and I started counting. And in the span of 10 years, I had sung 3 non-Asian roles. And I'm only half Japanese. I was shocked. I had no idea. And that realization, along with talking to my friends at this opera company, I was like, something has to change. We have to start doing something. And so the two of us started talking amongst several other Asians that we knew in the industry, and we started thinking about like, how are we going to advocate for Asians? We brought in a tenor friend of mine who had said, you know, all these groups are doing benefit concerts for Asians, but no one has asked me to participate in these concerts. And his name's Adam Deagle. He's one of the co-founders of AOA with me. And I said, Adam, no one knows you're Asian. And he said, what? I was born in Korea, you know, like, how does no one know I'm Asian? And then he started thinking about it. He was like, you know, actually, when I made my med debut, they wanted to say that I was from Seoul, Korea. And I remember thinking, no, I can't let them say that, because I haven't ever seen a successful Asian have a successful career in opera. And so he said, I was raised in Memphis, Tennessee, and that's, you know, how he decided to identify himself. And so as we started talking, we started realizing that there was a lot of work we could do together. We had seen the Black Opera Alliance form the year before and had seen the results they were getting from advocating for Black singers. And we thought, okay, let's do something similar. And so we got together and we decided the first thing we would do is we would send a letter to general directors of opera companies around the United States. And this would be a letter just kind of telling our story and letting them know that we're here and that we're advocating for change. Because in my opinion, the first way that to even start to create change is by creating awareness. And for so many generations, Asians have not been necessarily known to be people who speak up and create awareness. So we sent out a letter, and I actually have the 4 things that we advocated for in this letter. The first one says, cast us, strive for better representation by hiring Asians for both Asian and non-Asian specified roles of all sizes on stage. Normalize and value our role as interpreters of both edgy new works and the operatic canon. Until we regularly become part of your seasons, performing in roles of all sizes, we will be relegated as other. The second one is include us. Normalize seeing Asian people at every level of production, administrative and artistic positions, seek out Asian donors and board members, invite us into your DEI initiatives. The third one was pursue us, dedicate resources seeking out Asian talent and mount new and contemporary works that uplift Asian composers, stories, and voices, or that reimagine established works. And then the fourth one is consult us. Madame Butterfly, for example, is the quintessential example of an operatic masterwork that perpetuates harmful stereotypes. However, as the opera world grapples with issues related to racial justice and anti-Asian hate, the solution cannot be to excise Madame Butterfly from our repertoires. In effect, this eradicates 2 of the few starring roles for Asian women, roles in the past that have gone to non-Asian women in yellowface. When you produce Butterfly, we recommend identity-conscious hiring practices, hire Asian singers, creatives, educators, etc., to bring this masterpiece to life with the care it deserves. Companies must also be aware, though, that hiring Asian singers to portray Asian-specific characters can lead to pigeonholing and tokenization. The best way to circumvent this is to make a conscious decision to cast the same artists for non-Asian specified roles in future seasons. And so this letter went out to over 200 opera companies in the United States. And that was the beginning of the Asian Opera Alliance. And it's been quite a journey ever since then.
So can I ask, what was the response that you received? And sorry, we wrote out these questions, but I'm already deviating from them. Which is how a conversation goes, I think. And I don't know if we well go through it.
There's someone outside you.
Oh,
come on in.
Yeah. Just without betraying any confidence, what was because this organization was born after there had been some movements of increasingly greater awareness that had been brought forward for DEI initiatives in the classical music world that we're, I think, all aware of to some degree. So how was this received?
Well, I actually recently went back and looked at some of the emails that we received right after sending out this email. I think it went to 220 some odd companies. And since we sent it out in July of last year, we only received responses from 17 companies of any acknowledgement or even thanks for being here or anything. That being said, we have reached out to certain companies and we've said, we see that you're doing butterfly, or we see that you're doing these things, and how can we help? One of the things when we established the Asian Opera Alliance was that we wanted to, instead of call out, we decided we wanted to call in. And we wanted to be a resource, serve as a resource to the industry, which has not necessarily talked about a lot of these issues before. And so since then, we've had some really great response. We've had some people who have said things like, well, I've been to go see opera in Asia, and there are lots of Asians on the stages in Asia, to which we said, yes, but we're advocating in the United States, at United States opera houses, and we've had other companies that have come to us and have said, here's our DEI plan, and we're really proud of it. If you take a look at what our season was like in, 2017-18, for example, versus this season, we have increased our diversity by this much percent and done this. And then you go and you look at their website, and it's great, but what they've done is they've brought in a whole Black cast for Bohème, and that's all they're doing. But they've, they say, oh, it's diverse, but is it really diverse if you're only bringing in like Black singers to sing in one opera? Or are we talking about like a rainbow of diversity, which is totally different? And so we gone back to them and said, this is wonderful, and it's great that, like, obviously you're listening to the Black Opera Alliance and you're listening to our calls for change. But when you're creating this change, we want to see, a stage that reflects our society, and we don't want to go and see, an all-white cast or an all-Black cast or an all-Asian cast. We want to see a rainbow of colors in front of us.
So your work is not, even though it was born from advocating for a certain cultural background, you're trying to increase diversity in all ways. And what is important, I think, for all of us to hear is this idea of how you've gone about doing it, by not calling out people. And so that's a sort of a different starting point for the conversation, and obviously a conscious choice that you made. Could you talk to us about why you made that conscious choice? And I would say that part of it probably has to do with the bio that I read at the beginning of the amount of organizations with whom you've worked.
Absolutely, yeah. When I decided that it was time to start this alliance, one of my big fears was, I am in the prime of my career right now. I had just made my lyric opera debut. I am at the place that I've been working to be at for my whole career. And what happens if I start calling people out and I start creating, a ruckus, and people blacklist me, or people say, oh, she's a problem creator, or like, she's too much, we don't want her here. So one of the things, as Adam and I and Gabrielle, our third co-founder, were talking about when we started AOA was, how can we make sure that as self-employed people who only go to an opera company for a month at a time, and then we have to find another job, and then another job, and another job, that we're not blacklisted in this industry, but in fact that we're helping create change, and that we're helping. That was like the key word for us, was how can we help? And that was something that was really important to us, is that A, we're not blacklisted, and B, that we want to be here helping.
So is what we see happening on the opera stage unique to the experience that you have had, that Asian Americans have had? Or is this part of a much larger, because it's easy for us, I think, to to focus solely on our work on the opera stage. But is this a wider classical music industry? Is this a wider cultural, like, entertainment industry? How far out does this go?
It goes everywhere. We know representation matters, right? Like, it matters what we see on stage. It matters if we're able to identify with other people that we see. I tell a story sometimes about when I was in junior high school. This will show you my age. You probably don't even know this person I'm about to talk about. But in junior high school, I was given an assignment to write an essay about a famous person on TV. And I was told, okay, you have to compare and contrast with this famous person. How do you look like them? How are you different from them? And I went home and I remember saying to my mom, I have no one I can write about. There is not a single person on TV or in the movies who looks like me. And like, I asked my mom recently if she remembers this conversation. She says she remembers it really well. There was nobody who I could identify with. And the person I wrote an essay about, and this is what ages me, is Shannon Doherty. I don't know if you know her, but she was like the star of 90210. And the only reason I wrote about her was because she had dark hair and a round face. And that was like the closest thing that I could find to representation. Fast forward that now to 2022, and I've been sitting in hotel rooms all season watching Netflix and whatnot, right? And I'm not necessarily a reality TV person. However, I happened to stumble upon Love is Blind. I don't know if any of you guys watched that. Season 2, we had an Asian, East Asian woman. We had an Indian couple. We had a Black couple. We had, a Latino man. We had a white couple. We had, interracial couples. And all of a sudden, you're looking at that screen and you're seeing somebody who looks like you. And I remember, like, for the first time, there's an Asian woman. There's been stuff like 90 Day Fiance and whatnot, where you see people going to different countries, but in the United States, there is a show where I see someone who looks like me. And it happens that way in theater as well. If you go to an opera and if you're looking at a stage where they've put Ping Pang and Pong into yellow face, and you are, they've got Fu Manchu mustaches, and you look at people on stage and you're like, are they making fun of me? And then you look at the people who are around you and you're like, okay, everyone here is white. How is that going to affect the way they look at me in society? And so, it's really important, and it's pervasive in our society in general and at large, that when we see people othered, that's how we then kind of think, oh, maybe that's the way I'm supposed to treat them. And so I think it's not just on stage, but it's in our society in general.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Please, yes.
So a couple of weeks ago, we had
African American Art Song Alliance.
Art Song Alliance, yes. And I posed the question I would like to pose to you as well. The question is, the alliance you and your friends created is Asian American Opera Alliance, right?
Asian Opera Alliance, yeah.
Asian Opera Alliance. Does that include everybody in the Asian community, or only Asians in America, or who identify as American Asians?
Yeah, so that was, something we grappled with as we were trying to figure out how we were going to do this. And obviously I'm Asian American, and my co-founders are also Asian American. But as we started talking about it, there are so many different identities within the United States of what is considered Asian. You've got South Asian, Southeast Asian, East Asian. You've got Asians who were born in Asia. You've got Asians who were born in America. And so what we decided with the Asian Opera Alliance was we were going to advocate for anyone who identifies in any way as Asian who works in American opera companies. So that's how we decided we're advocating for Asians in American opera companies.
Because you had to create some sort of framework
Right.
that was focused enough to try and engage in these conversations, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, if you look at the amount of Asian American singers born in the United States, there aren't a lot. There are a lot more that are up and coming, but like I am one of the oldest Asian American singers that's working in the United States right now, and that says
And you're
something.
not that old,
And I'm not that old.
for the record. So Nina, you've been working with specific companies, but let's think more broadly.
Mhm.
What are the things that professional organizations, so thinking of artistic directors, casting, artistic administrators, board of directors, because everyone is part of that ecosystem.
Mhm.
What are the things that they can do to be more inclusive in a way that actually achieves the goals that you're talking about?
Yeah.
Because we've heard about some of the attempts
Yeah.
that perhaps have really fallen short,
Yeah.
regardless of the nobility of the goal or lack thereof. So what does that change really look like, broadly speaking?
So obviously cast diversity, right? Like we got to make sure that we're seeing on stage a reflection of what our society looks like. We are in a very Eurocentric art form, but we can now reflect what our multicultural society looks like on those stages. And then obviously, like if you're going to offer Asian singers an Asian role, make sure you're also offering them non-Asian roles too, because I don't know if you know, but something I learned as I got into this advocacy work is that pigeonholing and typecasting is actually a form of racism. And I was kind of shocked, like, oh, of course it makes sense, but I'd never thought about it that way before. So obviously cast diversity. Another thing that I think is really important that we do and that we think about doing is hard because it costs a lot of money, but we in the United States keep remounting these old productions that have been around for 20, 30 years. It's, you know, cheaper to rent a production, to rent sets and costumes and whatnot, and bring in a new director who kind of gets to reimagine something, but on an old set that is, you know, potentially has a lot of things that aren't culturally accurate or whatever. So I think designing new productions is a really great way for us to work on making our art form less Eurocentric and more multicultural. But we can, like, it's easy to do with all of these operas in the can, and it just takes a little bit of creativity and a little bit of like willingness to invest and to change, as long as you've got, you know, character lines that are that make sense throughout the opera, and as long as you're showing this humanity, you can really set opera anywhere if you're creative enough to think about how to do that. If you are remounting an old production, which a lot of companies have to do because we don't have the funds, we're not, you know, government supported like opera is in other countries. So if you are going to remount an older production like Butterfly, that's a very traditional Butterfly, one thing that we really encourage opera companies to do is to do the work surrounding the opera. So bring in Asian American scholars to talk to your audiences. Make sure you're doing pre-performance discussions. Make sure you're talking about some of these really difficult conversations that can be painful and hard to have, but are really important, because bringing awareness to all of this is the only way that we can move through it. You know, I am personally an advocate of not canceling these operas, because if you're canceling these operas, you know, I had multiple productions of Madame Butterfly canceled this year because people were worried to mount it due to the violence that's been happening against Asian women in the United States. So, you know, my first reaction was, well, that's great that you're trying to protect me, but you're also taking work away from me as someone who's only sung Asian roles. and you're also creating erasure of my face on a stage. And so are we actually doing good by canceling this, or are we creating more harm? So what if we remount these shows and then we make a promise that next time we do this butterfly, maybe we won't do it in such an Orientalist way, right? Like maybe we will be more creative with these productions, but that it's important that we do the work surrounding it, write the blogs, you know, talk about this stuff and make sure that we're learning and growing from our past mistakes. And then, you know, another thing that I think that is really important in the opera industry is making sure that you don't have one person making all the decisions. You know, we live in this world of gatekeepers where for many years it's been older white men who have made the decisions on casting, on you know, programming, on all this stuff. And so bring in diverse voices to help make these decisions and to make sure that we're doing the work in the right way. And then the other thing that I think is really important is to reach out to our surrounding communities, because, you know, opera is really, we do this for our audiences. Like, we can perform in operas on stage, but is it special if you don't have a live audience? We all know from being on Zoom the last 2 years that there's nothing like being in front of a live audience, right? And so we need to talk to our communities and learn about what they want to see and what they would like to learn about and to grow with our own company. Oftentimes we just reach out to our donor base, right? And which tends to be wealthier, older population, and we're trying to please them. But what happens if we look further into our communities, and that is a great way to make these changes.
So it's really not opera community, it's wider community that you serve. And I think there are some companies that really strive for engaging with the wider community, and they distinguish themselves. We don't need to talk about those specific companies in this forum, but they do distinguish themselves because the programming is different. You see more diverse programming that clearly is not there just to sell tickets, but is there to engage. And the idea that engage is a conversation that goes both ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes, please, yes.
So are there any, like, is there any repertoire that you think maybe should be left by the wayside that like can't be done in like a truly like progressive way, like maybe like the Mikado? Or
So
like,
so you raised, and we were even talking about this, so like, let's just throw out some titles that you could maybe respond to. And so you mentioned the Mikado,
Yeah.
Gilbert and Sullivan Mikado. Puccini wrote 2 operas that
well,
are,
Turandot's a weird one
so-
too, because like the source material, like a Persian story. It's
so
Yeah.
Turandot,
like
Pearl Fishers.
Pearl Fishers,
Butterfly.
Bizet, and then
Or-
Butterfly.
oh my gosh, wait, the Entering Alston.
Yeah, So can you respond, because there's some specific parts that are considered by many to be in the canon
Right.
that you see regularly programmed. Do we say there's some that we should just leave away?
Yeah,
Cool.
so we were just kind of talking about this recently, earlier today, and I know the Mikado, like, problematic, right? We love that word. Can be seen as very problematic. But a small company called Intermountain Bozeman Opera, I don't know if you've heard of it, just last month produced the Mikado, calling it the Montana Mikado. And what they did was they took all of the music and they took out all of the references to Japan, and instead they made fun of their own communities within Montana. They had like the cowboys and the skiers and the what, and the, you know, three little maids from Instagram, da 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 da. And it was like all about Instagram. And they changed the words and it was fantastic. And then around that, they had all these great conversations online with different, like they brought in the Asian Opera Alliance, they brought in different groups to talk about Orientalism and have these discussions. I think especially operas that are, you know, out of copyright, is it really bad to change a couple of words here and there? I don't know. Like, you know, one of the biggest like problematic things in Butterfly these days is, oh, that she's a 15-year-old girl. 15 years old, you know, a couple hundred years ago was very different than 15 years old now. And so is it a horrible idea to make her 18 or 20? You know, like, how can we make changes where we're still telling stories and stories that still happen in our world today? Like stories like Butterfly happen still. So why not reimagine them a little bit and make it appropriate for our society today? That being said, we can also have this conversation about the fact that there have been many Orientalist operas that have not survived this many years, right? So we can talk about why Butterfly and Turandot have stayed around. And I think that's another important conversation to have. Like, it's the most gorgeous music you've ever heard, right? Like every time I'm in Butterfly, I just sit there and I'm like, I'm so lucky to be listening to this music right now. Like there's reasons that these operas have survived. So why not help them survive, make a few changes, and then we can all thrive because of those changes.
When we think about some of these operas that are set in a somewhat specific time period, and maybe that's more through tradition. I remember being part of many Butterfly productions where the biggest conversation in a production team is, what does the American flag look like? Because a patron is going to say, that's not accurate to whatever.
How many stars? And
yes.
Yeah.
And so that level of detail, if that were taken with everything, and if it were to be an updated production in some manner, because you're right, some of these productions are set. And what's the flexibility if this is what is required, this is what the costume is, this is, I mean, all of those things. And hearing your perspective of making some changes to those is important and vital for their survival, and that having some of these pieces live on is a good thing. It's very helpful for all of us, I think, to just hear and having these complicated conversations to untangle something.
Yeah, I mean, a great book to read if you're interested in is called Final Bow for Yellowface, written by Phil Chan, and he's in the ballet world, but he's been kind of like a mentor to me. And he worked on really trying to change the Nutcracker, the Chinese dance in the Nutcracker. And this year, I think it was Pacific Northwest Ballet, took the exact same choreography from the Chinese dance that has lived for generations, right? And turned it, instead of a caricature on stage, into a cricket. And it became a cricket. And like, why can't we reimagine Ping Pang and Pong as something other than like caricatures? It would be really easy for them to be something else and still tell the same story, just without making fun of people.
No, this is very helpful. Sorry, I'm thinking about so many things here, and I keep doing my job here. Okay. So you and I have spoken about some specific conversations that you've had with companies, and without revealing anything, you know, so we've talked about like what are some broad steps companies can take, but what are some of the kinds of conversations you're now having, because they're probably related to more specific things, and how are we going to start to measure whether or not those conversations are making change? Because how do we decide this engagement is occurring, or whatever? Let's put in whatever you want to. This conversation is happening. Engagement maybe, and then how do we measure whether or not that is actually leading to any kind of change?
Yeah. Well, you can look at my career, kind of, especially looking at this season, as a way to measure, just because I know my career. So I said like 3 roles in 10 years. This season at WNO right now, this is my 7th new role already this season. I've got 1 more role that I've done a lot coming up next, and then some concerts this spring. But out of those 7 roles, 5 have been non-Asian. So in 1 season, just from creating awareness as to what's been happening in my own career, I've almost doubled in 1 season what I did in 10 years. That being said, look at next season for me, and I'm back to doing all Asian roles. So obviously, my work is not done yet. So I think that, you know, that there's a lot of Band-Aids being put on things right now. And we're seeing that as we're advising companies. You know, we've talked to a lot of companies who are talking about change, but are we creating lasting change, or are we putting Band-Aids on things? And I think right now we're still putting Band-Aids on things. You know, I've advised some really big companies who say, oh, because AOA says it's okay to produce butterfly, we're going to produce butterfly. But that's not the only thing we're saying. We're saying there's a whole lot of work that you have to do around these productions and within these castings. And if you're hiring an Asian singer to come and sing the role of butterfly, like for me, example, I did butterfly at a company a few years ago, and I've been back to do nothing since, and I am doing another butterfly there. And if we're not doing anything in between, we're not creating that lasting change. We're just creating this cycle. And so I think, you know, it's important that we keep talking about these issues, and that we know that one season is not going to change anything. It may disrupt things a little bit, but this is long-term work. This is stuff that we all will be doing, hopefully, you know, for our entire careers. And you know, something that's been interesting to me too is for opera companies to come to us and say, we want to meet, we want to talk about, you know, ways we can create change. And then we'll come into a discussion and they'll say, okay, so what ideas do you have for us from Asian Opera Alliance? And, you know, to which we respond, no, what ideas have you brought to us that we can now collaborate with you with? You know, it's not just our responsibility to do this work. It's work that everyone should and can be doing. We're here to help, and we are excited to help, but it can't be solely put on us.
So this is a great segue into that we are part of a larger educational institution.
Yeah.
And on a regular basis, we have to think, what are the institutions that we are part of as students, as educators, as wider community members? What can we do to be part of this work? What do we need to be doing better, completely differently? You name it, because we have a variety of cultural backgrounds within our student body, within our faculty. We strive for greater diversity for certain, but no matter what your cultural background is, I hope that we can find ways in which we are contributing. And I think that's where the rubber hits the road. So real talk about educational institutions, what do we need to do?
Yeah, well, you know, something that we find very interesting in the Asian Opera Alliance is we see a lot of Asian singers in universities in the United States. There's a very high percentage of Asian singers that are in conservatories, but what we're not seeing is how these singers are then transferring into the real world. So I think there's a lot of factors that go into this. I can only speak from, you know, the Asian experience, because that's kind of what I've been studying and what I've been working on. But, you know, part of it has to do with, like, are we making sure that we are coaching our singers in the right ways, and like English diction and things like that. I think, you know, it tends to be a lot of times that Asians who, you know, have names that are maybe more difficult to pronounce or understand or even hold in your memory sometimes get lost in so are we educating ourselves in how to you know, like you hear a lot about, oh, all Asians look the same or whatever, right? And that we've seen mistakes happen where, you know, one Asian singer's face is put with another Asian singer's name, and like on social media, right? And so how are we supporting those around us? And I think, like, making sure that we're providing effective curriculum. Like, I mean, it sounds like you guys are hosting lots of really great conversations. And we need to make sure that, like, the curriculum that we're presenting, it's not just about how to be a good singer performer. How can we make sure that our artists in university settings are shining as brightly as possible? Because we all know that it takes a whole lot more than a good voice to have a career these days. I think also something that we really need to look at is like our hiring policies. And I think, you know, there's for sure been a huge change in universities recently in the way we're hiring and making sure that we're having like DEI initiatives and stuff. But how is it like when we're hiring that we're supporting this new progressive idea of diversification versus leaving our whole industry in the idea of Eurocentric classical music? And are we reaching out in ways that we haven't reached out to make sure that we're hiring diverse people to come and then educate our diverse student body? I think that's really important. I think it's equally important to make sure that we're not like making any lump ideas based on the way someone looks. Like, you know, I don't know if you all saw the New York Times article that happened last summer about Asians in orchestras and how, you know, all these microaggressions happen, that Asians are seen as not being musical and being very like analytical and computer-like and whatever. Like, we have all of these ideas that have presented for many years of what a certain group of people is like, and so trying to educate around that and know that I mean, we're all different human beings and we all have different experiences. I think that's really important. And then like also not just bringing students in, but making sure that we're giving resources, right? And that, which you guys are doing here, that we're expanding the minds of our students, take into account socioeconomic status. It's not just racial. It's also, you know, are we first generation college goers, and how does that change the way we are when we're in college? You know, there's a lot of things that we consider as educational institutions on how to educate our student body to make sure they're as well-rounded and as ready to be in this diverse society that we live in.
That's a lot.
There's a lot.
So I'm gonna now think specifically about the students that we have that are ready to embark into the professional world. And your starting point for this work was mid-career as far as advocacy work.
Yeah.
Even though I think you've been an advocate your entire life,
Yeah.
but a more public advocate with this organization.
Yeah.
When people are just beginning their career trajectories and there is so much to balance, what does that look like? And what are ways that you can be living your truth, you can be advocating, but that you're also not necessarily identified singularly as an advocate, but as an artist advocate, as a, you know, whatever it is that these young people would be interested in being identified as?
Yeah. I think
you could just say it's complicated.
no, it is very complicated. Absolutely. If you were to have asked me when I was your age, how, or even a few years older, how I identify, I would have told you I identified as a daughter, as a Californian, Southern Californian, you know, even earlier in my career, a wife, a mother, a singer, obviously a musician. I studied violin in college, so I come from, before I was a singer, as a violinist. And that was how I identified. And it wasn't until I became an opera singer that people started identifying me as Asian. And then I was like, okay, I better figure out what it means to be Asian. Like, I'm fourth generation Japanese American. My grandparents were interned during World War II. There was very little, if any, Asian culture passed down, because it was like, let's be as American as we possibly can. So my identity was not Asian. And so it's been an interesting realization for me, and in a way a struggle advocating for something that I haven't necessarily always identified as. So, you know, I think as much as we wish that everybody in this room was going to have a successful singing career, it probably won't happen. Sooner or later, you'll see that half of these people are running opera companies or are artist managers, or like people that I went to ABA with are now, you know, on the other side of the table. So I think making sure that you know, like Craig and I go back, well, we realized
We forgot, yeah.
we both forgot. We worked on a production when I was still in school in 2007, and he played the piano for this production that neither of us remembered. But we go back.
It was that memorable, not because of us, we're sure of it, but yes.
We go back many years. And so as we're establishing ourselves in this career, knowing that these relationships that we form will be lifelong relationships, and that we can be advocates and we can create these bonds early on, and we can continue to lift ourselves up and lift our friends up and work together, I think is a big thing. You know, when I was in school, there was very much this idea of like, well, you have to, there's another mezzo, and you know, you guys are gonna have to compete against each other. But once you get out into the real world, it's not like that. You're hired for a job and you come in and everybody is supportive and friendly, and there's not the competition that you necessarily experience in school. So I think like establishing a really great base from when you're starting your career, and knowing that like these are people that you're going to work with for the rest of your life. So how can we help each other? I think it's a really great way to start thinking about things.
That's very helpful, I think. But I don't want to speak on behalf of the students. I wonder if there are any questions that any of you have before we continue. Yes, Matthew. Yeah.
You talked about like obviously having conversations with the directors of the opera companies and things like that, but the importance in like speaking to diverse communities that may not know about opera, or asking them the questions like, what would allow you to come to the opera? What would you like to see there? Can you just like speak about that work a little bit, and how you might have gone about doing that?
Yeah, for sure. So I had a really interesting conversation. I think I have to talk about the company name and the work, because it was with the Met, with fire shut up in my bones. And you know, they were talking about how exciting it was that they saw new audiences.
So the Met opened with this season,
a
work
Yeah,
finally by an African American composer, Terrence Blanchard.
yeah,
So a creative team that was diverse looking, but no doubt, but
yeah.
the first time ever for the Met to open with that
Yeah.
was history in the making.
Absolutely, right? And they had more diverse, more new audience members than they've seen in years, right? And like, but then the thing is, well, how do we get them to come back? And that's something that, you know, I think everyone is still grappling with. Like, how many of those people who came to that production have come back to see anything else? And why is it that they're not coming back to see anything else? And I think this is something that's really important that we think about as we are creating these new productions, even of operatic canon works. Like, how can we make sure that someone wants to come see Traviata as much as they want to come see Fire? Like, and there are ways we can do this. And a lot of it has to do with reaching out into our communities and talking about, for example, I'm doing a butterfly next year in New Orleans. And what they've done is they went out into their community and started to talk about like issues that people of color face in their community. And one thing that came up over and over and over again was the idea of being biracial and the idea of being othered. And so they've then taken those two things when they talk to their community, and that is what they're going to focus on, not only within the production, but surrounding the production too, and having these conversations. So I think there are ways that, like, how can we introduce new audiences to opera, and how can we keep them coming back? Another, you know, obvious thing is the price of tickets, right? Like, not very many people can afford to go to the opera. So are there ways that we can change and make opera more accessible, besides going into schools and whatever and doing that type of education? What happens if we make opera tickets less expensive and we take a cue from you know, other industries where they make a ton of money selling concessions, right? Why hasn't the opera world picked up on that? Like, why aren't we lowering the price of our tickets and making money elsewhere surrounding our production? I think there are ways that we can make opera more accessible, but again, it just takes being creative. And, you know, some of the things that, like, I'm sure Craig can talk to you about is, like, it's not just, there's a board behind all of these decisions, right? And everybody has a board of directors. Some of these boards are 60, 100 people. They're like multiple tier boards. So making some of these changes is a lot more difficult than it may look from the outside. And something we talk about a lot is how do we diversify our boards? So it's not just wealthy white people who are donating money to make sure that, like, opera continues. Are there other ways that, besides donating money, that you can join a board? Can we look at other nonprofits that are not operas, and how are they using their boards, and how are they creating diversity within their boards? Can you, you know, consider donation of time as a donation? Can you have a board in training for young people who might be interested but don't know what it takes to be on a board? There are different ways that we can make opera more accessible. It takes time and it takes creativity.
But also what you hit upon there is the idea that if you engage with a diverse community for one specific production, that's going to be the end. And so why do you do Traviata after you do Fire Shark? Because it's a story worth telling. If you believe that as an organization, how do you engage with an audience and make sure you present it in a manner that other people are interested in coming to see it, that are maybe beyond your traditional donor base?
Absolutely.
Which takes creativity,
Absolutely.
which takes engagement, sustained engagement, sustained. And that's actually something I think all of us in an educational institution can learn how to do, is learn what it's like to be part of those conversations. Because if you were to, as a student, reach out to a nonprofit organization and offer your expertise in engaging the community members to educate them about, you know, this production, I bet they would take you up on it in some way. Like someone who wants to talk about the value of this art form and why it matters, sign me up, absolutely. So, and that starts to become a viable path of ways that you can become an artist.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, like, there are small companies, I don't know how many people you have on staff.
Relatively modest.
Right.
Yeah.
There are many, you know, smaller regional companies where there's 3 people full-time on staff, right? And so.
And that's the majority of the companies in the US.
Right.
There's more of those size companies than the big A houses when you look at the breakdown. Yeah.
So how, you know, and you know, another thing I talk about a lot is like regional opera and how important regional opera is. I saw this post on Facebook the other day about, like, why are we bringing so many European singers to America when we have so many American singers? Why is opera, you know, not more regional? And why is it bad to be a hometown singer, right? Like, why do our hometown companies never hire us? Because we're local, right? And so I think these are all things, but then again, go to these companies and say, hey, I've got this idea, you know, and like, I was surprised, and I was, you know, hired to consult on a show. I've never consulted, but I've got lots of great ideas, so why not, you know? Like, yeah, absolutely, expand these thoughts and these ideas, and it can become a career for you too.
Cool. Kira, you had a question as well, yes.
Yes, I did. Sort of returning to the conversation we were having before about university level stuff, engagement. I was wondering, when you were completing your training, what were the conversations that you had surrounding race and inclusion when you were a student?
So I finished ABA in 2009. And the only thing I remember talking about with race was, I remember one of the coaches, when I was coaching butterfly for the first time, say, are you sure you want to take this job? Because it may be the only thing you ever sing. And I was like, no, I'm a good mezzo, I'll sing other stuff. and we coached it, and that was that. And, you know, life has changed a lot in the past 12 years. You know, there were no discussions about this. Even, you know, maybe 5 years ago, there were very few discussions. Things have changed so much, especially since the pandemic, especially since summer of 2020. And, you know, like there has been a lot of talk about how things need to change. And there was not this discussion, you know. It's something that people may or may not know is that even if you're Asian, you can be put into yellow face makeup. Yellow face is not, you know, just for a white person who, you know, puts on, changes their skin color and changes the shape of their eyes. You can also be an Asian and put into yellow face makeup, which I have been, has happened to me many times as Suzuki. And it was just, that's the way it was. How can we make her look more Asian? You know? So there's been a huge shift. And I think it's really exciting because, you know, you guys are the first real generation of people that will come out of this shift, and how will you change our field? It's really exciting.
And we were talking earlier about this balance of, in order to want to change something, you have to know what it is first. And so this, like, the need to educate ourselves deeply with everything, with all the repertoire, and you know, not just European repertoire, but everything that is non-European as well. And then you can begin to see, okay, so what can we change? And I think that's what falls on us as professors to try and do. There's another question over here. That's Amanda.
Hi, so if you're ever in a situation that you're asked to do something uncomfortable or that's racially insensitive, how would you recommend having those conversations?
Yeah, that's really hard, especially as somebody who like is not tenured in a job, right? And you're always looking for your next job. And, you know, as opera singers, we don't have connections with like the general directors and artistic directors of companies. Oftentimes we might meet them and say, hi, thanks for having me here. And then we're off to our next job, and you're always wanting to be rehired. And how can you have a conversation like this sensitively? I think there are ways to do it, but there are also resources outside of who you are as an artist that are important to know. Like, you're always welcome to come to the Asian Opera Alliance, and we're happy to take something like that up for you. Or, you know, the Black Opera Alliance does as well. And I think that, like, if you're worried about retribution, there are people now who can help with those things. But I think it's also really important that we learn how to speak in a respectful way and say, hey, you know, I'm a little uncomfortable with this. You know, I went to a talk where I heard Nina talking about this, and I know that there are going to be people in the audience who may be a little offended by this, and can we at least have a conversation about it? And I think having a conversation is the first step. And then, like, hopefully we start to see more diverse voices within those production teams, where we're not maybe the only Asian in the room, where we don't feel like we might be in trouble for speaking out against something that doesn't seem right. Hopefully, if we start to see more diverse people in the room in general, we will be able to easily have these conversations.
So we could go on for a long time, which is the sign, I think, of a wonderful, fruitful conversation. Thank you for being here, those of us in person as well as virtually, and thank you, Nina, for being here to continue the work that you're doing. And I hope that you can consider all of us part of this change to the best of our ability. And I think we also have some increasingly a greater amount of knowledge of what is truly helpful. So thank you.
And if you guys haven't heard about Written in Stone at WNO, you should really think about coming. It's all the operas are written by people of color, and the casting is very colorful. They're beautiful stories. We opened Saturday. We go through the 25th. I know there's a discount code that I sent
Which,
to
yeah,
Craig.
yeah, everyone was sent that from a grant.
And it's really exciting to see these multicultural stories being told on a stage at the Kennedy Center, because this is where opera is going, and it's really exciting to see this change.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Great.